At a peaceful rest stop on a quiet rural highway, a young black girl and her father, who was white, pulled off to stretch their legs during a long road trip. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting a golden glow across the parking lot. Only a few cars were parked, and the place seemed almost deserted. It was the kind of place people stopped when they needed a break or wanted to grab a snack before getting back on the road. For most people, it was a brief stop, just enough time to stretch their muscles, grab a drink, and keep going. The father and daughter had been traveling for hours, their journey taking them through stretches of lonely highways. The little girl had been quiet for most of the ride, her face pressed against the window, lost in thought. Her father, on the other hand, was focused on the road, adjusting the radio as they cruised through the countryside. He wasn't one to stop often, but this time the road was long, and he needed a break. The two got out of the car, stretching their arms and legs as they looked around. The girl wandered a bit ahead of her father, moving slowly, looking up at the sky, and trying to shake off the stiffness from sitting for so long. She hadn't spoken much during the trip, but something about the quiet of the rest stop seemed to calm her. It was peaceful here, almost too peaceful. Not far away, a man in military uniform parked his car and got out, taking a break from his long drive. He was a Marine, on leave for a few days, and traveling back home after a training session. He had just finished a few weeks of tough drills, and now he was enjoying the open road. The rest stop was the perfect place to stop, get a snack, and relax for a moment. He stretched his arms as he walked across the parking lot, feeling the weight of the long drive in his muscles. As he walked past the father and daughter, something caught his eye. The girl's gaze seemed to linger on him for just a moment, but there was something in her eyes that made him stop. It was hard to put into words, but the way she looked at him made him feel uneasy. She quickly looked away, and he kept walking, but something about her stuck with him. It wasn't just her glance that felt off, it was the way she moved. There was an odd tension in her posture, a way she stood with her hands tucked at her sides like she was unsure of what to do. The Marine's instincts told him something wasn't quite right, even though the father didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He thought it was probably nothing, just his mind playing tricks after a long day. But something deep inside him urged him to keep an eye on them. He couldn't explain why, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The Marine was trained to notice small details, things others might overlook. It was part of the job, paying attention to body language, the way people acted, and what wasn't being said. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something beyond the quiet calm of the rest stop. As he walked past them, he took a final glance back. The girl's eyes locked on his again, but this time there was a small movement with her fingers. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But to the Marine, it was clear. She had made a gesture, a signal for help. His heart skipped a beat as the unease that had been growing in him turned into certainty. Something was wrong, and he had to do something about it. The Marine continued walking across the rest stop parking lot, but his mind kept drifting back to the little girl and her strange gesture. At first, he thought he might have imagined it. It was so subtle, barely a movement of her hand, but something about it didn't sit right. He had seen similar signs before, small gestures that people made when they needed help but were too afraid or too nervous to speak up. It wasn't uncommon for someone in distress to try to communicate quietly, hoping someone would notice. The Marine stopped for a moment, his boots scraping against the gravel. He looked back toward the girl and her father, who were now sitting on a nearby bench. The father was focused on something on his phone, and the girl was looking down at the ground, avoiding his gaze. The Marine couldn't help but feel a nagging feeling in his stomach. There was something wrong, something more than just a quick break on a road trip. He instinctively scanned the area, taking in the rest stop surroundings. There weren't many cars, just a few scattered around the lot, and it was unusually quiet. It was the kind of place where people stopped for a few minutes and then moved on. But there was no sense of urgency, no sign that anyone was leaving anytime soon. The Marine glanced back at the girl again, who had now shifted her position, her back slightly hunched. Her posture seemed off, like she was trying to make herself smaller, trying to hide from something. Her father still hadn't noticed, his attention completely absorbed by his phone. The Marine's instincts told him that this was no coincidence. He had learned in his training to trust his gut, especially when it came to situations like this. He couldn't shake the feeling that the girl had sent him a signal, even though it was small. Her fingers, barely moving, had formed a shape that was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. It was the international distress signal, a subtle gesture that could be used to ask for help when words weren't possible. It could be something as simple as a quick motion with the fingers, signaling for someone to come closer. And the Marine had seen it before in situations where people were in danger but couldn't speak out. He stood still for a moment, debating whether he should approach them directly. He had never been the type to get involved in someone else's business, but something about this felt different. The girl's fear was palpable, even from a distance. He couldn't just walk away, not knowing what might be happening. After a few moments of hesitation, he decided to act. He turned back around, walking slowly toward the father and daughter. As he moved closer, he tried to keep his expression neutral, not wanting to alarm anyone. He didn't want to jump to conclusions or make the situation worse, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut, the sense that something wasn't right. He had to find out more. The Marine felt his heart rate quicken as he approached, hoping he wasn't making a mistake, but also knowing he couldn't turn back now. The Marine moved cautiously toward the father and daughter, his steps slow and deliberate. He wasn't sure how to approach them, but he knew he had to be careful. It was important not to make them feel uncomfortable or suspicious, but at the same time, he had to find out if the girl needed help. His military training had taught him to read people, to pick up on small signals and body language, and right now, every instinct was telling him that something was wrong. As he approached, he took a moment to assess the situation. The father was still sitting on the bench, his attention fixed on his phone. He seemed relaxed, completely unaware of the tension that the Marine felt building between him and the girl. She was standing a little apart, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though trying to hold herself together. Her gaze shifted from the ground to the Marine as he got closer, but she didn't speak, and her father didn't seem to notice her discomfort. The Marine took a deep breath and forced himself to smile, keeping his tone friendly and non-threatening. He didn't want to scare anyone off. He casually introduced himself, mentioning that he was just passing through on a road trip of his own. His words were light, meant to keep the conversation casual. But even as he spoke, he kept his eyes on the girl, watching for any signs of distress. Her body language spoke volumes. She wasn't looking directly at him, but there was an unmistakable unease in her posture. It was like she was trying to keep a distance, not wanting to draw attention to herself, but at the same time, there was a quiet urgency in the way she moved. The Marine made a point to ask about their journey, hoping that talking might ease the tension, and encouraged the girl to speak up if something was wrong. Her father responded easily, telling the Marine that they were on a long road trip to visit family. The words were ordinary, nothing unusual about them. But the girl didn't speak much. She just stood there, looking down at her shoes, and shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Every so often, she would glance up at the Marine, her eyes flicking toward him and then quickly away, as if she was afraid of being caught looking. The Marine couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The father seemed entirely comfortable, but the girl's silence was telling. It wasn't just that she wasn't speaking. It was the way she held herself, the tension in her small frame. Her eyes were filled with something the Marine couldn't quite name, but it wasn't just fear. It was the kind of look that someone might have when they're trying to escape something, but they can't get away. He decided to keep talking, trying to keep the conversation going in a way that wouldn't raise suspicions. He asked about the area, mentioning how peaceful the rest stop was, hoping to break the silence. But his mind was racing. Every moment felt like it was stretching longer than it should. He needed to make sure that he wasn't reading too much into things, but deep down, he knew that the girl's subtle discomfort couldn't just be ignored. It was a feeling that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake. Something wasn't right, and he had to figure out what it was before it was too late. The Marine kept the conversation light and easy, but his mind was far from calm. He continued to watch the girl out of the corner of his eye, trying not to make it obvious that he was paying so much attention to her. Her father was still engrossed in his phone, not seeming to notice anything strange. He was chatting about the weather, mentioning how the long drive had gotten boring, but the Marine wasn't focused on the dad's words. His eyes were locked on the girl. She was now standing with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Her gaze flickered toward the Marine, but each time she looked away quickly, almost as though she was trying not to be noticed. She was doing her best to remain calm, but everything about her posture and body language was tense. Her fingers were fidgeting slightly, and her lips were pressed together, as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The Marine felt a rising sense of urgency in his chest. There was no denying it now. Something was off. It wasn't just her gestures. It was the overall feeling he was getting from the situation. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first glance, but the more he observed, the more he noticed the little signs of distress. Her body language screamed that she was uncomfortable, even afraid, but she wasn't speaking out loud. He couldn't ignore the gut feeling that kept gnawing at him. His instincts told him that he couldn't walk away, not without knowing for sure. He couldn't just leave and wonder if he missed something important. He had to do something, even if it meant risking looking foolish or overreacting. His training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him that he needed to help this girl. Trying to be casual, the Marine turned back to the father and asked a few more questions, keeping his tone light. He asked about their trip, how long they'd been on the road, and where they were headed. The father seemed more than happy to answer, rattling off details about their destination, but the girl stayed quiet. She didn't even look at him as he spoke. Instead, she stared at the ground, her shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to make herself smaller. Every time she shifted, it seemed like she was trying to hide, to blend into the surroundings, but her unease was so clear to the Marine. He took a slow breath, trying to think of his next move. He had to be careful. If he pushed too hard, it might scare the girl, or worse, alert her father that something was wrong. But he couldn't just stand there and let it go. The Marine gently shifted his focus back to the girl, his voice calm but firm as he asked her if she was okay. It was a simple question, but the way he asked it was meant to convey that he wasn't just making small talk. He was serious. For a long moment, the girl didn't respond. She just looked down at her shoes, her hands still clasped tightly to her sides. But then, in the briefest of moments, she lifted her eyes to meet his. Her expression was one of quiet desperation, and for just a split second, the Marine saw it. The silent plea for help. The look that said she needed someone to step in, but she couldn't say the words herself. Her eyes flickered away quickly, but the damage had been done. The Marine had seen it, and he knew that something was wrong. He wasn't imagining it. There was no doubt left in his mind. He needed to act before it was too late. The Marine stood there, his heart racing as he processed what he had just seen in the girl's eyes. For that brief moment when their gazes locked, he had caught a glimpse of something deep, something silent but powerful. It was fear, and it was unmistakable. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough to understand that she was asking for help, even if she couldn't voice it. He tried to steady himself, to remain calm and composed. He couldn't afford to show his own anxiety. Not now. The girl's father was still absorbed in his phone, oblivious to what was unfolding around him. It was clear that the man wasn't paying attention to the subtle cues his daughter was sending. He didn't seem to notice her nervous glances, her tense posture. The Marine was torn between his training, which told him to remain patient and gather more information, and the growing sense of urgency that pushed him to act immediately. His instincts told him that every second mattered. He had to be careful, though. He didn't want to alarm the father, nor did he want to put the girl in a more dangerous position if he was wrong. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. Something told him that waiting wasn't an option. After a moment of silence, he turned back to the father, keeping his voice steady and casual. He asked more questions about their travels, about their plans for the rest of the journey. The father answered easily, speaking about their destination with enthusiasm. The man seemed harmless enough, but it was his daughter who remained the focal point of the Marine's attention. She wasn't engaging with the conversation, still standing apart, her arms tightly folded, her eyes downcast. The Marine watched as the girl's fingers subtly twitched, as if she was fighting an inner battle, wanting to say something but holding back. The small movements weren't much, but they were telling. Her body language was speaking louder than words. It was a sign of someone in distress, someone who didn't know how to ask for help, but was desperate for it nonetheless. The Marine's gut told him that if he didn't act soon, he might lose the chance to intervene. His instincts screamed that the girl was trapped in a situation that wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. But he couldn't rush it. He needed to make sure he wasn't jumping to conclusions. What if it was all in his head? What if the girl was just shy, or the father was simply a relaxed, distracted parent? He couldn't be sure, but he couldn't ignore the signs either. The father glanced up from his phone and looked at the Marine, as if just now noticing him standing there. He smiled politely, clearly unaware of the growing tension. The Marine forced a smile in return, trying to act casual. But inside, his mind was working quickly. He knew he couldn't let this moment slip away without taking action. He had to find a way to connect with the girl without making things worse. It was then that the Marine made a decision. He would keep it simple. He would talk to the girl directly, away from her father, and see if she would speak up. The situation couldn't be ignored any longer, and the more he delayed, the more time the girl might be losing. He took a step closer to her, his voice soft but steady. "Hey, are you doing okay?" he asked, his eyes focused on her face. There was no mistaking it now. He was asking her for real, not just as a casual question. He needed her to know that she had someone who cared, someone who was watching out for her. And maybe, just maybe, she would find the courage to say what she needed to say. The Marine stood there, waiting, watching the girl closely. The moment stretched out longer than he expected, and for a second, he thought she might not respond. The girl's eyes flicked up to meet his, her gaze filled with something the Marine had come to recognize over his years of training. An emotion he couldn't ignore. Her face softened, her lips parted just slightly, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. There was a long, uncomfortable silence between them, and the Marine's mind raced. He had asked her if she was okay, but the hesitation in her eyes told him she wasn't sure how to answer. She looked over at her father, who was still lost in his phone, completely unaware of what was unfolding. Her gaze lingered on him for just a moment, before she quickly turned her attention back to the Marine. Finally, the girl spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help me," she said, her words so quiet that they almost got lost in the air between them. The Marine felt his heart skip a beat. Those two words were all it took to confirm everything he had been feeling. She needed help, desperately. She hadn't said anything earlier, not wanting to alarm her father, but now, in this moment, she had reached out. The Marine's chest tightened with both relief and the weight of the situation. He had heard her. And now, it was time to act. He didn't waste any time. The Marine quickly glanced over at the father, still oblivious to the conversation unfolding between them. It was clear now that the girl was in danger, and he couldn't wait around any longer. He had to make sure she was safe. His first instinct was to reassure her, to let her know that he believed her, that she didn't need to be afraid anymore. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You're safe now. I'm going to help you," he said softly. The girl's eyes widened with a mixture of fear and relief. For the first time since he had approached them, she seemed to relax, just a little. Her shoulders lowered, and her hands, which had been clenched tightly at her sides, began to loosen. The Marine knew he couldn't delay any longer. He had to get her away from her father, without raising suspicion. He glanced around the rest stop, making sure no one else was too close, but the area was still quiet, with just a few cars parked here and there. He turned back to the girl and gave her a small, reassuring nod. "I'm going to call for help. Just stay calm, okay? Everything's going to be all right," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl nodded, her eyes brimming with emotion. She was scared, yes, but there was something else, something deeper. She had trusted him with the truth. She had trusted him to help her. And that was something the Marine couldn't take lightly. He was already reaching for his phone, his mind working quickly. He needed to contact the authorities, but he also needed to make sure the girl was safe in that moment. Every decision mattered. As he began dialing, the Marine couldn't help but glance at the girl one more time. Her posture had changed. She was no longer standing tensely, waiting for the next move. For the first time, she looked like she might be able to breathe again. But the Marine knew this wasn't over. The real challenge was still ahead, and he had to stay focused. He had promised to help her, and he wasn't going to let her down. The Marine's fingers trembled slightly as he dialed the number for local authorities, his mind racing with thoughts of what could happen next. As the phone rang, he glanced at the girl again. She stood still, her body now more relaxed but still clearly on edge, her gaze never straying far from him. The quiet, unspoken understanding between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was her protector, the person she trusted to help her out of this. He couldn't let her down. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before it was finally answered. The Marine's voice was steady but urgent when he spoke. "This is Sergeant Walker. I'm at a rest stop off Highway 72, and I need immediate assistance. There's a girl here, and I believe she's in danger." He quickly provided the details of his location, describing the situation as best he could, but all the while keeping his eyes trained on the girl, who seemed to exhale in relief as the words left his lips. "I've made the call. They're on their way," the Marine said, turning back to her once he hung up. He spoke with calm authority, but inside, his heart was pounding. Even though the authorities were on their way, the girl still needed his protection, and they weren't there yet. He couldn't take any chances. He stood between her and her father now, a quiet shield in the middle of it all. For a moment, there was silence between them, just the distant sound of wind rustling the leaves. The father, still oblivious to what was unfolding, finally looked up from his phone and smiled at the Marine. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice cheerful but laced with a hint of suspicion. The Marine, sensing the father's unease, gave a casual nod, keeping his expression neutral. "Yeah, just a chat," he replied smoothly, hoping his calm demeanor would prevent any alarm. But as the Marine kept his eyes fixed on the girl, he saw a flicker of something. A brief, almost imperceptible movement in her posture. It was as if she was waiting for the moment when it would all break, when someone would finally step in and change everything. Her hands trembled slightly, and her gaze turned toward the car for a split second, as if she were still contemplating an escape, a way out of this trapped situation. But the Marine didn't let her feel alone in that moment. He stepped closer to her, his body language protective, signaling that she was not going to face this alone. The tension in the air thickened as the father began to get up, seemingly ready to continue on their way. But the Marine held his ground, positioning himself in such a way that the father couldn't pass without coming into his line of sight. The father shot him a questioning look, but the Marine's calm presence made him think twice. There was no need to escalate things yet, not until he knew more. Minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity before the sound of sirens grew faintly louder in the distance. The Marine exhaled in quiet relief, knowing that help was coming. The girl's eyes met his once again, this time with a mixture of gratitude and a silent, wordless thank you. She had reached out for help in the only way she could, and now she was going to be safe. The Marine's role in all of this wasn't over. He had to make sure the authorities knew exactly what was happening, that they understood the urgency. But for now, he remained by the girl's side, keeping her calm, watching as the moments ticked by, knowing that the danger wasn't over until she was safe. As the sirens grew closer, the father's demeanor began to shift. His casual air began to evaporate, and the Marine noticed his eyes darting nervously between him and his daughter. The tension between them was palpable now. The Marine didn't need to say anything. He could feel it in the air. Everything was about to change. The sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the rest stop. The Marine's body tensed slightly, but he kept his composure. His eyes never left the father, who now seemed aware that something was amiss. The man shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching as though he wanted to do something but didn't know what. He looked from the Marine to his daughter, who was standing stiffly, her gaze now fixed on the approaching emergency vehicles. The Marine remained calm, his posture unyielding, standing between the girl and her father, protecting her in that brief but crucial moment. He could feel the weight of the decision now, the truth starting to settle in that everything was about to change for this little girl. He knew the police were only moments away, but even that felt like an eternity. When the first patrol car pulled into the lot, the lights flashing brightly against the quiet surroundings, the Marine took a deep breath. His heart rate didn't slow down, but his mind was clear. He nodded to the officer who stepped out, signaling for them to come over. The officer's eyes shifted briefly to the girl, and then to the Marine, recognizing the seriousness of the situation. Without a word, the officer walked up to the Marine and then turned his attention to the father, who was now visibly nervous. The girl's father, still in a state of confusion, tried to speak, but found himself tongue-tied, unable to form a coherent sentence. The Marine gave the officer a quick nod, silently telling him everything he needed to know. The officer calmly moved toward the father and began speaking to him in a low voice. There was no need to escalate things further. The Marine knew the officer would handle it from here, but the truth was, he wasn't sure how this would unfold. The girl's body seemed to relax slightly as the officer took control of the situation. She looked up at the Marine, her eyes filled with silent gratitude, and for the first time, the fear that had held her so tightly seemed to dissipate just a little. The Marine offered a reassuring smile, his heart swelling with a quiet sense of pride that he had done what needed to be done. As the officer spoke to the father, it became clear that the man was more rattled than he appeared. His words were becoming more frantic, his hands shaking as he spoke. It wasn't long before the police realized the full scope of what was happening. The truth began to unfold, and the girl's quiet, desperate plea for help had led to the exact outcome they had all hoped for: safety. The father was soon handcuffed, his earlier composure now replaced with a look of disbelief. The Marine watched silently as the police officers took control of the situation. They moved with professional precision, securing the area and questioning the father. There was no need for the Marine to say anything more. His role was done, and the girl was safe. He glanced down at her one last time, her posture now a little more relaxed, her shoulders no longer tense. She wasn't smiling, not yet, but there was something in her expression that told him she knew she was free. The weight she had carried was no longer hers to bear. As the police officers finished up their questioning and prepared to take the father into custody, the Marine gave the girl a final, encouraging nod. She didn't speak, but her eyes spoke volumes. She was no longer trapped. She was free. The Marine stepped back, knowing that this moment, this decision to act, had made all the difference. He didn't know what would happen to the girl after this, what her future would hold, but he did know one thing. He had saved her from something darker, something that would have followed her had he ignored his instincts. With the police taking care of the father and the girl safe, the Marine turned and began walking away, his heart still pounding but his conscience at peace. He had acted when it mattered most, and in the end, that was all that mattered. He knew that he would never forget the look in the girl's eyes when she realized that someone had finally noticed her silent plea for help. It was a look that would stay with him forever.